The snowstorm didn't care that she was old, homeless, or running out of strength. An elderly woman and her dog wandered through the blizzard, carrying nothing but loyalty and fear. Every house was warm, every window lit, yet every door stayed closed. Until her dog stopped in front of a lonely cabin on the mountain and refused to move. Inside lived a former Navy SEAL who had shut himself off from the world after losing everything he loved. One knock on the door would pull him back into danger, justice, and a fight no one expected. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true stories of compassion and faith. The town below the mountain looked gentle from a distance, windows glowing, chimney smoke climbing into a hard, star-bright sky. Yet up close, the cold had teeth. It slipped under doors and into lungs. It turned small mistakes into emergencies. On nights like this, people didn't only gather around their stoves to keep warm. They gathered to keep the world out, to keep grief from finding a seat at the table. Far above the town's ribbon of street lights, a lone cabin clung to the slope. A single square of amber light bled through a narrow window, as if the mountain itself was holding a match against the darkness. The man inside had chosen that cabin for the same reason he chose silence. It didn't ask questions. Mason Hale was 40 and built the way disciplined years built a body. Broad-shouldered, solid, athletic in a controlled, practical way, like someone who trained to function, not to impress. His face had the clean, sharp structure of a man who'd learned to keep emotion from showing on the surface. Strong jaw, angular cheekbones, no beard, no softness he couldn't justify. His hair was dark brown, kept in a neat undercut that always looked freshly cut even in the middle of nowhere. Cleanliness was one of the few comforts he still trusted. His eyes were blue-gray, steady, watchful, eyes that had looked down corridors and into dust storms, eyes that had learned to read danger in a posture and mercy in a breath. He wore what he always wore, even in winter, even in isolation. A fitted green camouflage long-sleeve top and matching camo pants, both cut close to the body, tactical and tidy. A dark tactical belt sat firm around his waist, with a pouch and a holster-like carrier that suggested tools always within reach. Tan high military boots stood by the hearth when he was inside, thick-soled and made for unforgiving ground. A luxury metal watch with a black face and steel band caught the firelight whenever he moved his hands. It was a small indulgence, a reminder that time still existed even when he tried to live outside it. Tonight, Mason was doing what he did every night the weather turned mean, managing the cabin like a mission. He stacked split wood near the stove, checked the latch on the back door, ran a cloth over the small framed photograph that lived on the mantel. The picture was old enough that the corners had softened. A woman's face smiled out from it, warm, brave, tired in the way only mothers were tired. Her hair was pulled back, and her eyes held a calm certainty that made Mason's throat tighten whenever he looked too long. His mother had been his last true home. She had died while he was overseas, one of those cruel timing jokes the universe liked to play, the kind that made a man believe in fate only to hate it. He had returned to a house that felt like an empty shell. He had sold what he could. He had driven north until the roads narrowed and the air smelled like pine and distance. He didn't hate people. He didn't even hate the town below. He just knew silence was easier to manage than memory. The fire popped. Mason sat with a mug that had gone lukewarm, staring into the stove as if it might show him a different life if he stared long enough. He didn't. That was the bargain. You traded miracles for predictability. And then the sound came. Not the wind, not the settling of old boards. A knock, soft, almost careful, like someone who didn't believe they had the right to ask for anything. Mason's body answered before his mind did. His shoulders tightened, his breath lowered. His attention sharpened into that familiar, narrow beam. For a second he hated himself for how quickly the past woke up in him. Then the knock came again, followed by something quieter, a scrape against wood and a low, restrained whine that didn't belong to the forest. Mason moved across the cabin without wasting motion. He didn't grab a weapon. He didn't keep one displayed, didn't give his grief. That kind of power. But his posture changed the way it changed when he was about to open a door in a place where doors had been traps. He paused with his hand on the knob. Cold bled through the metal. He listened. There was breathing outside. Two patterns, one shallow and unsteady, one steady and low. He opened the door. The winter lunged in, sharp and clean, carrying snow and pine and the smell of frozen earth. On the porch stood a woman, old enough that the cold looked like it had been chewing on her bones for years. Edith Caldwell was 72, small and stubbornly upright, though her shoulders trembled with fatigue and exposure. Her hair was silver white, twisted into a low bun that had started to unravel. Loose strands clung to her forehead. Her face was lined but not fragile. There was pride in the set of her mouth and humor in her eyes, even as they watered from the wind. She wore a chestnut-brown wool coat that hung heavy over her thin frame, a cream turtleneck beneath it, dark slacks and old leather boots built for slick sidewalks and bad luck. A gray scarf was wrapped too tightly around her throat, the kind of knot a person made when they were afraid. A small crossbody canvas bag rested at her hip, light enough to mean she hadn't carried much out into the storm. Beside her stood a German shepherd, male, about 5, large and muscular, with a thick winter coat colored black, and tan so dark the black saddle swallowed most of his back. His ears stood upright like drawn blades. His eyes were deep amber brown, intelligent and steady. Snow dusted his muzzle. His chest was broad, stance proud, the kind of posture that belonged to working dogs. One front paw, his left, touched the boards with a faint hesitation, a subtle limp that said old injury, healed but remembered. Around his neck, not a full harness, but a scorched strap fragment hung like a relic, burnt edges, warped buckle, the kind of thing a dog didn't need but kept anyway, because it meant something. He stood slightly in front of the old woman, angled into the wind so it hit him first. He didn't bark at Mason. He didn't rush. He only looked directly, deliberately, like he was measuring the man in the doorway the way Mason had measured strangers in other lifetimes. Mason's first instinct was to ask why. His second instinct was to not ask anything at all, because questions invited stories, and stories invited attachment, and attachment had once cost him everything. Edith didn't beg. She didn't put on the trembling voice of someone performing poverty. She simply lifted her chin and said, "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for one night of heat." Her voice was thin but steady, the voice of someone who had lived long enough to understand the difference between pride and foolishness. Mason's throat tightened, not with sympathy, but with recognition. The dog shifted his weight, keeping his body between Edith and Mason, not threatening, protecting. Mason saw it immediately. He had seen it in men, too. He stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," he said, and surprised himself with how calm it sounded. Edith hesitated only long enough to make sure he meant it, then moved inside with careful steps. The German shepherd followed, turning his head once to scan the dark porch and the tree line beyond, then stepping over the threshold like a sentry entering a post. The cabin's warmth wrapped around them. Edith's shoulders sagged the moment the cold stopped biting her face. Mason guided her toward the stove without touching her, respecting the boundaries of someone who'd been forced to lose enough already. He pulled a chair close to the heat, draped a folded blanket over her shoulders, and set a kettle on the stove. His movements were efficient, practiced. Not gentle exactly, but careful. The dog moved to the inside of the door and lowered himself there, back toward the wind, as if the door might open again without warning. He lay down, but he wasn't relaxed. His ears stayed up. His gaze tracked everything: Mason's hands, Edith's breathing, the corners of the cabin. The limp didn't stop him from that vigilance. "What's his name?" Mason asked, because he needed something simple to say. Edith glanced at the dog as if she drew strength from him. "Sable," she replied. There was affection in her voice, but also respect. He's the reason I'm standing." Sable's eyes flicked to Edith when she spoke, then back to Mason. Mason didn't like the way that gaze made him feel, like a man being asked to be good. He didn't know if he still remembered how. He moved through his small kitchen corner, pulling out a pot, canned broth, dried vegetables, whatever he had that could become soup. He kept supplies for storms, not for company, but hunger didn't care about intent. Edith's hands trembled around the mug of hot water he set near her. As the steam rose, color began to creep back into her cheeks. "You live up here alone?" she asked, not prying, just observing. Mason nodded once. "Easier?" he said. Edith's mouth twitched. "Easier is a strange religion," she murmured, and somehow it wasn't an insult. It was a confession. Mason glanced at the mantel without meaning to. The photograph caught the firelight. Edith followed his eyes. She didn't comment. The soup simmered. Silence settled, not hostile, but cautious. Two wounded animals circling the same warmth. Sable let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind that sounded almost like a sigh. Mason noticed his paw, how it held itself a fraction off full weight. Old fracture, he thought. Cold made old injuries talk. He knew that too well. When the soup was ready, Mason set a bowl in Edith's hands. She took it like it was sacred. The first spoonful made her eyes close. For a moment, she looked like a child. Then she opened them again and became an old woman, with pride. "Thank you," she said simply. Mason nodded, as if gratitude was a thing he could accept without flinching. That was when it happened, the small, careless betrayal of paper. Edith shifted in the chair, reaching to adjust the blanket, and the strap of her canvas bag slid. A thick envelope slipped out, hit the floor with a soft thud, and skidded toward Mason's boot. Sable's head lifted instantly. His ears angled forward. His gaze sharpened, not toward Edith, but toward the envelope, as if the paper carried a scent. Mason froze. Not because of the envelope itself, because the dog's reaction didn't fit. Dogs reacted to food, to strangers, to threat, not to documents. Yet Sable stared at the envelope the way he stared at the door. Mason crouched, picked it up. The paper was stiff from cold. The top corner bore a neat logo, North Star Lending. Beneath it, bold letters, Notice of Foreclosure. Mason's fingers tightened. Something in his chest shifted, an old, deep hinge creaking open. He looked at Edith. She had gone very still, the way people went still when shame entered the room. "It's not what it looks like," she said, but her voice betrayed her. It was exactly what it looked like. Mason didn't speak. He slid the envelope onto the table, face up, not as an accusation, but as reality. Edith's eyes flicked to it, then away. "My kids are gone," she said quietly. "Not gone, just far. Work, lives, they call, they love me, but love doesn't pay a winter bill when the roof caves and the furnace quits." Her humor tried to return, but it couldn't cross the gap. "I thought I could handle it. I thought I could borrow a little, patch things, get through. And then," she swallowed. "And then the numbers changed. The papers changed. The door got chains." Mason listened. He didn't interrupt. That was something the military had taught him, oddly enough. Sometimes the best way to keep someone alive was to let them speak. Sable rose, limped once, then moved to Edith's side and leaned his shoulder against her shin. Not pleading. Grounding. Edith's hand fell onto his head, fingers trembling in the thick fur. Mason stared at that gesture and felt his throat tighten with a grief he hated for still being tender. His mother's hands had looked like that, older than they should have been, hard-working, gentle. His mother had sat near a stove, too, waiting for him to come home. He hadn't made it in time for her last day. He had been thousands of miles away, saving strangers, while his own world collapsed quietly. That fact lived in him like a splinter that never stopped hurting. Re-hook. Sable suddenly turned his head toward the window. Not the door, the window! His ears snapped forward. He stood perfectly still, every muscle tight, staring at the darkness outside as if the night had just spoken his name. Mason followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw only snow and pine shadows. Then, far, down the slope, a faint flicker of light where there shouldn't have been one. Not the town, not a porch lamp. A brief moving glow, like a vehicle light cut and brought back, half hidden behind trees. It vanished, returned, vanished again. Sable let out a low, controlled sound from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, more like a warning offered to someone who understood warnings. Edith's hand tightened on the dog's fur. She started, then stopped, as if naming them would summon them. Mason didn't move quickly. He moved precisely. He crossed to the window and stared into the dark. The light was gone now. The forest looked innocent again, but Mason's instincts, dormant only because he'd forced them to sleep, were fully awake. He turned back to Edith. Her face was pale, not from cold now, but from dread. "Do they come looking?" Mason asked. Edith's eyes shimmered. She nodded once. "They like to remind you," she whispered, "that you're owned." Mason's jaw clenched. Not anger, calculation. He had left the world to escape ghosts, not to invite new ones. Yet here they were, stepping onto his porch in the shape of an old woman and a dog with a limp and a scorched strap. Fate didn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it arrived as paperwork sliding onto a cabin floor. Mason walked to the door, checked the lock, then slid the bolt into place. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't speak about protection like it was a promise. He simply did what his hands knew. He returned to the stove and added 2 logs, watching the flames strengthen. "You're staying," he said, voice low, final. Edith looked up. "Just one night," she began. Mason shook his head, cutting her off. "As long as it takes for the storm to pass." He didn't say the other thing that sat behind his words, as long as it takes for him to decide what kind of man he still was. Edith's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She exhaled like someone who had been holding her breath for days. Sable settled back at the door, still facing it, still on guard. Mason sat across from Edith with his own bowl of soup, but he didn't taste it. He watched the old woman warm her hands, watched the dog watch the world, and felt something shift in him that had nothing to do with pity. It was a recognition, sharp as winter air. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a test of the life he'd built. The cabin was quiet again, but not the quiet he had worshipped. This quiet had a heartbeat in it. It had need. It had consequence. Edith's gaze drifted to the photograph on the mantel. "She looks kind," Edith said softly, as if asking permission. Mason didn't answer right away. He stared at the picture until his eyes burned. "She was," he finally said. The word came out like it weighed 100 pounds. Edith nodded once. "Then you learned from the right fire," she murmured. Mason almost smiled at that. Almost. Outside, wind hissed through the Iggy pines. The stove crackled. The cabin held its breath. And Mason Hale, who had spent years perfecting the art of not being needed, sat across from a stranger and realized that the night had handed him a choice he could not ignore. He could close the door on the world again in the morning, Or he could let the fire mean something. Edith drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, surprising him. "For showing up, for bringing trouble to your door." Mason looked at her hands, raw knuckles, tremor now fading. He saw his mother again, and the old pain rose like a tide. He swallowed it. "You didn't bring trouble," he said, and his voice held a steel gentleness he didn't know he still owned. "Trouble was already out there. You just made it visible." Sable's ears flicked at Mason's tone, as if the dog recognized a vow when he heard one. Edith's eyes met Mason's, and in them was not gratitude alone, but something older trust offered with nothing left to bargain. Mason stared into the fire and felt the strangest thing. Not hope exactly. Hope was too bright a word. This was something dimmer and sturdier. Purpose, maybe. The kind that didn't sing. The kind that simply stayed. The chapter ended the way winter nights often ended on Crow Ridge, without ceremony. Edith's breathing slowed as she drifted into exhausted sleep in the chair near the stove. Sable stayed at the door, a black and tan statue carved from loyalty and instinct. Mason did not sleep. He sat with his back to the wall, eyes on the window, listening to the mountain and the faint occasional settling of old wood, knowing that somewhere beyond the trees, a company with polite paperwork and sharper teeth might be counting the hours. And for the first time in a long time, Mason wasn't only listening for danger. He was listening for what his mother's photograph seemed to ask in the firelight. What do you do when someone cold finds your door and the world dares you to be kind? Morning arrived sharp and bright, the kind of winter morning that looked merciful from a distance and hurt the moment you breathed it in. The sky over Crow Ridge was a hard blue, scrubbed clean by the night wind. Mason opened the cabin door and let the cold in, only long enough to judge it. The air carried the metallic bite that told him it would stay below freezing all day. He wrapped a scarf around Edith's shoulders, careful not to fuss, and guided her onto the porch. From there, the mountain fell away into the town below. Roofs glazed with frost, smoke rising straight up from chimneys, streets pale and quiet as if the place were holding its breath. Edith stood with her hands clasped, the wool of her coat pulled tight across her chest. In the morning light, she looked smaller than she had the night before, as though the fire had lent her strength and the daylight had taken it back. She pointed with a gloved finger toward a cluster of trees near the edge of town. "There," she said. Her voice carried a steadiness that came from repetition. She had practiced this explanation in her head many times. "The house with the cedar siding. You can't see the porch from here, but it's there. Or it was." Mason followed her finger. The house sat at the boundary between the last line of streetlights and the dark mass of the forest, modest and square, the kind of place built to be paid off slowly and lived in forever. "That was my whole world," Edith added, not with nostalgia, but with fact. Sable stood close to her leg, his head level with her knee, watching the town the way he watched everything, with attention that never quite relaxed. In daylight his size was more apparent, a heavy chest, thick winter coat, black saddle broad across his back. His left front paw touched down carefully when he shifted, the old injury making itself known in the cold. Mason noticed it without staring. He noticed everything now. Inside again, with the door sealed against the cold, Edith sat at the table while Mason poured coffee he rarely drank himself. Her hands shook less than they had the night before, but the tremor was still there. "I borrowed to fix the roof after the storm," she said, picking up where she'd left off. "It was supposed to be temporary. The man on the phone had a warm voice, said they specialized in helping people like me. Fixed incomes, emergencies." She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Funny how everyone wants to help when they're charging you for it." Mason listened, leaning against the counter, his posture relaxed, but his attention precise. "The interest climbed," Edith continued. "The papers came with numbers I didn't recognize. I called. They said it was standard. I signed because I was tired, and because I believed them when they said it would stabilize. 2 months later, a letter came. Another number. Another signature that wasn't mine." Her mouth tightened. Then they came in person, polite, clean. Coats, they spoke like neighbors. They put the notice on my door and told me I had a week to leave. Mason felt the familiar pressure build behind his eyes. He'd seen this pattern before, just in different uniforms. Systems didn't need cruelty to ruin people. They only needed indifference and time. "We can call the police," he said, not as a solution, but as a door he was willing to open if she wanted it. Edith shook her head slowly. "The law stands with paper," she replied. "Not with old women who don't read the fine print fast enough." She looked at him then, really looked, as if measuring whether he was the kind of man who needed to hear more. "I didn't come here to ask you to fix it," she added. "I just needed to survive the night." Mason nodded, accepting the boundary. He'd learned long ago that help offered without consent was just another form of control. Sable moved around the cabin, nose low, tracing lines Mason couldn't see. He paused near. The back door sniffed the threshold, then the wall beside it. His ears tilted forward, then back, calibrating. Mason watched him with a professional interest he hadn't expected to feel. "He's alert," Mason said. Edith smiled faintly. "He always is, since the fire." Mason's gaze sharpened. "Fire?" Edith hesitated, then nodded. "Years ago, warehouse on the edge of town. He ran into smoke he shouldn't have run into. Came out with that strap burned into him. He never liked closed spaces after." She touched the scorched fragment at Sable's neck. "Neither did I after that year." Mason didn't ask more. Trauma didn't need to be excavated to be understood. By late morning, Edith's cough returned, a dry, rasping sound that pulled at Mason's attention. He offered to drive into town for medicine. Edith protested out of habit. Mason didn't argue. The truck growled to life, tires crunching over frozen gravel. Sable jumped into the passenger side without, waiting to be told, curling carefully to protect his bad leg. Mason noted the efficiency of it, the way the dog managed himself. The road down the mountain was narrow, cut into the slope like an afterthought. Mason drove with one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting near the gearshift. The town came into clearer view, ordinary and deceptively calm. At the pharmacy, Edith stayed in the truck with the engine running. Mason stepped out, boots hitting pavement with a sound that drew a few glances. He didn't look like he belonged to the town's slow rhythms, and he didn't care. Inside, he picked up antibiotics and cough syrup, moving through the aisles with the quiet purpose of a man who didn't shop so much as acquire. When he turned back toward the counter, he nearly collided with a uniform. Deputy Connor Wren was mid-30s, tall enough to meet Mason's eye without craning his neck, his build solid in a way that suggested farm work before the badge. His hair was light, brown, cut short, his face open but tired, with faint lines at the corners of his eyes that came from squinting into weather and paperwork. He wore his authority the way some men wore heavy coats. Necessary, a little cumbersome. "Mason Hale," Connor said, recognition softening his tone. "Heard you were back in the area." Mason inclined his head. "Passing through," he replied, which was close enough to the truth. Connor glanced at the items in Mason's hands. "Everything all right?" Mason considered how much to say. "Helping someone," he answered. Connor nodded, then hesitated, as if something were lodged behind his teeth. "If you need anything," he began, then stopped himself. His eyes flicked briefly to the logo on the foreclosure notice visible through the pharmacy window on a bulletin board across the street. A public posting Mason hadn't noticed before. North Star Lending. The name landed between them like a dropped coin. Connor's gaze slid away. The moment passed. Mason didn't push. Outside, the general store sat across the street, its windows cluttered with flyers and handwritten signs. Mason stepped in to grab supplies. The bell over the door rang, bright and false. That was when he saw the man by the shelves, mid-30s, clean-cut, wearing a dark work jacket over a gray hoodie, hands in his pockets like he owned the place. His hair was cut close, his beard trimmed short along his jaw, giving his face a blunt, contained look. He moved through the store with measured steps, eyes cataloging shelves and space, not buying anything. When he turned, his gaze locked on Mason with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Morning," the man said, his voice smooth, friendly enough to pass casual inspection. "You're new around here." Mason met his look without mirroring the smile. "No," he said. The man's eyes flicked toward the truck outside, toward Edith's profile visible through the windshield. "I'm asking around for an elderly woman," the man continued lightly. "Seems she wandered off last night. Cold out there." Mason felt something settle into place. "Not your concern," he replied. The man tilted his head, assessing. "Everything's someone's concern," he said, still smiling. "Name's Silas Kett." He extended a hand. Mason didn't take it. "She's safe," Mason said instead. Silas let his hand drop, unbothered. "Good," he said. "Wouldn't want accidents." His eyes lingered a fraction too long on Mason's watch, his boots the set of his shoulders. He was measuring value, Mason realized. Not money exactly, but risk. Silas stepped aside, allowing Mason to pass. "Enjoy your stay," he said, and the words sounded like a forecast. Back in the truck, Edith noticed Mason's silence. "You saw one of them," she said softly. Mason didn't deny it. He drove back up the mountain with the feeling of being followed, even when the road was empty. By bright afternoon, the sky had shifted. Clouds moved in low and fast, smudging the blue into gray. Mason stacked more wood near the stove, his movements precise. Edith rested on the couch, her breathing easier with the medicine. Sable paced the perimeter of the cabin, nose tracing old scents. He stopped near the tree line, ears lifting. Mason followed his gaze. Nothing moved. The world looked ordinary again. As dusk fell, a truck appeared on the lower road, a dark shape parked where no one parked unless they were waiting. The engine cut. No doors opened. The truck simply sat, a patient blot in the gathering dark. Sable rose, muscles taut, but he did not growl. He stood and stared, the way he had the night before, holding the line between warning and restraint. Mason felt the truth settle into him with a clarity that surprised him. Offering Edith shelter had not created a problem. It had revealed one. He had stepped into a story that had been unfolding quietly, counting on people being too tired, too cold, too alone to resist. Mason shut off the porch light, leaving the cabin dim from within. He didn't like being seen. He sat at the table and cleaned a tool he didn't need to clean, grounding himself in the familiar ritual. Edith watched him, her expression thoughtful. "You didn't have to," she said. Mason looked up. "I know," he replied. Outside, the truck's headlights flicked on once, then off again, as if acknowledging the cabin's presence. Then it drove away. Sable remained standing long after the sound of the engine faded, his attention fixed on the place where the road disappeared. Mason watched the dog and felt a decision forming, not loud or heroic, but firm. He had tried to live without purpose, believing it safer. The mountain had answered him with a debt that wasn't written on paper, and a woman who refused to disappear quietly. The night closed in around the cabin, and Mason understood something he hadn't wanted to. The fire he'd been tending wasn't just for warmth anymore, it was a signal. Mason began to move, but not like a man chasing justice or playing the hero. He moved the way soldiers did when they understood the cost of noise, carefully, quietly, with respect for limits. Before dawn, while the mountain still held its breath, he replaced the cabin's locks, working with steady hands, numbed by cold. He checked the trail twice, once by sight, once by instinct, noting where snow lay too evenly, where it had been disturbed and smoothed again. He showed Edith how to layer blankets properly, how to trap heat without sweating, how to keep boots by the door and a flashlight within reach. He explained it the way he might brief a teammate, clear, calm, without condescension. Edith listened with the dignity of someone who had lived long enough to know that preparation was a form of respect. Watching him, she felt something bittersweet settle in her chest. He moved with the patience of a son who had learned responsibility too early, and she wondered, not for the first time, who had taught him to be so alone. Sable stayed close, pacing the edges of the yard, his breath puffing white in the cold. His coat bristled where the wind cut through the trees, black and tan fur thickened for winter. Every few minutes he returned to the same corner behind the cabin, nose pressed low, circling, then stopping. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stood there, ears forward, tail still, as if waiting for the ground itself to confess. Mason noticed. He trusted patterns, especially when they repeated without escalation. "Show me," he murmured, not expecting understanding, but offering permission. Sable moved aside, pawing once at the snow. The patch beneath was subtly different, compressed, uneven, carrying a scent Mason couldn't name but recognized as wrong. Metal, faintly sharp. Mason fetched a shovel and dug carefully, peeling back layers as though handling something fragile. Beneath the snow lay a small black device, no larger than his palm, magnetized to the fence post. A tracking unit, clean, cheap, disposable. Mason exhaled slowly. North Star hadn't just pushed Edith out of her home, they were watching who picked up the pieces. He wrapped the device in cloth and set it aside. This wasn't evidence yet. It was confirmation. Sable turned his head toward the tree line, nostrils flaring, then started down toward the frozen creek. Mason followed, boots finding purchase by habit. The creek lay under a skin of ice that sang faintly with each step. At the far bend, where a pine had fallen months ago and lay half-buried like a wound that never closed, Sable stopped. He sniffed the base of the trunk, then scratched once, twice. Mason knelt and brushed away snow. A nylon bag surfaced, buried shallow, hurried. Inside were copies of foreclosure contracts stamped with North Star's logo, names circled in red. Addresses clustered near roads, near old logging routes. Strategic. Beneath the papers lay a small USB drive, its casing scuffed. Mason closed the bag and stood, heart steady but heavy. This wasn't opportunism. It was design. He did not plug the USB into his own computer. Curiosity killed people who mistook information for control. Instead, he drove into town again, this time with intent. Harper Vale's radio station occupied a converted storefront near Main Street, the windows perpetually fogged by old heat. Harper herself answered the door. She was late 30s, slender but solid, with dark hair pulled into a low tie that kept it out of her eyes. Her face was sharp in a thoughtful way, high cheekbones, a mouth that tightened when she listened more than she spoke. Years of reporting had given her a posture that leaned forward as if the truth might try to slip past her if she relaxed. She recognized Mason immediately, not by name, but by bearing. "You look like trouble," she said lightly, stepping aside. "The kind that doesn't enjoy being here." Mason handed her the bag. "I don't enjoy much," he replied. Harper's humor faded as she looked through the contents. Her fingers paused on the contracts, then on the USB. "They've been sloppy," she said quietly. "Or arrogant." She explained that North Star had threatened her months earlier when she started connecting odd foreclosures to empty houses used briefly, then abandoned. Temporary storage, quiet transfers. They don't just lend, she said. They collect. Mason felt the pieces align. Harper met his eyes. If what's on this drive matches what I think, she added, this goes beyond predatory lending. Mason nodded once. Outside, the day darkened earlier than it should have. When Mason returned to the cabin, Edith's cough had worsened. Her skin burned under his hand, despite the cold room. He drove her to the town clinic, Sable riding stiffly in the back, eyes fixed forward. The doctor, a woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and a voice worn smooth by years of small town. Medicine, listened to Edith's lungs and frowned. Early pneumonia, she said. Treatable, but she needs rest, warmth, no stress. Mason swallowed the bitter irony. Time had become a currency they were short on. Night fell fast. Mason sat by the fire, listening to Edith breathe unevenly, counting the seconds between coughs. Sable lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes open. At some point, he lifted his head sharply, staring at the window. Mason followed his gaze and felt it. A pressure, not a sound, a presence. Re-hook came without warning. The fire popped, sending sparks upward, and Sable rose, hackles lifting, not in aggression, but recognition. He walked to the window and sat, perfectly still, facing the glass. Mason felt the hair on his arms lift. Outside, the snow fell harder, erasing tracks as fast as they could be made. In that moment, Mason understood something that went beyond tactics. Northstar wasn't just reacting, they were waiting. And Sable, with instincts honed by fire and loss, knew the difference. By morning, Harper called. Her voice was tight with restraint. "You were right not to open it," she said. "This isn't just local. There are transfers logged, dates, routes, houses used for hours at a time." Mason closed his eyes. "Can you protect the source?" he asked. Harper didn't answer immediately. "I can try," she said finally. "But they'll feel this." Mason looked at Edith, pale against the blankets, and at Sable, who had resumed his watch. He felt the narrowing of options, the familiar calm that came when the path ahead demanded commitment. He wasn't here to win. He was here to hold the line long enough for the truth to surface. And beneath the fresh snow, the footprints were already forming. Northstar responded the way organizations always did when their quiet systems were touched. Swiftly, politely, and with an edge that never raised its voice. Late afternoon light was already thinning when a dark SUV eased up the mountain road and stopped just short of the cabin. Mason watched from the window without moving, cataloging posture and timing. 3 men stepped out. Silas Kett led, his work jacket zipped against the cold, beard trimmed neatly along his jaw, eyes calm and appraising. Behind him stood 2 others, both in their 30s, broad-shouldered, faces set in the careful neutrality of men who had learned to wait. One wore a wool cap pulled low, the other kept his hands visible, palms open, as if to reassure. They moved with the unhurried confidence of people who believed the law would catch up eventually. Mason opened the door before they knocked. The cold slid in between them, sharp and deliberate. Silas smiled. "Just checking on our neighbor," he said, his tone warm enough to pass for kindness. "We heard there might be some confusion about occupancy." Edith stood a few steps back, wrapped in a blanket, her spine straight despite the cough that shook her chest. Sable stepped forward without command, positioning himself squarely between Edith and the threshold. He did not bare his teeth. He did not bark. He simply stood, weight balanced, eyes fixed on Silas with a steady, unblinking focus. The effect was immediate. One of the men shifted his feet. Silas's smile thinned, then returned, measured. "There's a debt attached to a property," he continued. "Debts don't disappear just because someone changes address." Mason met his gaze. "Neither do threats," he said evenly. Silas chuckled softly, as if appreciating a joke. "No threats here," he replied. "Only facts. Edith Caldwell doesn't have a legal residence at the moment. That can complicate things. Benefits, medical care, safety." His eyes flicked briefly to Edith, then back to Mason. The implication settled like frost. Mason felt his pulse slow. He'd heard this cadence before, language shaped to sound reasonable while pressing a blade under the ribs. "You should leave," Mason said. Silas raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Of course," he said. "We didn't come to cause discomfort." As they turned away, one of the men glanced back at Sable with a look that weighed cost. The SUV rolled down the mountain and disappeared among the trees. The quiet that followed was brittle. Dusk came fast. Clouds thickened, swallowing the last light. Mason set about the evening routine with deliberate calm, checking the stove, setting water to boil, laying out lanterns. Edith watched him with an expression that held gratitude and worry in equal measure. "You shouldn't carry this for me," she said quietly. Mason shook his head. "I'm not carrying you," he replied. "I'm standing with you." The power went out just after full. Dark, not a flicker, a clean cut. The heater died, lights vanished, the sudden silence ringing louder than sound. Edith's breath caught. Mason moved immediately, lighting oil lamps, adjusting the stove damper, speaking calmly about weather and outages the way one spoke to anchor the mind. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the trees with a sound that pulled Mason backward through memory, to nights where darkness meant exposure and exposure meant loss. He stayed present. He had learned how. Sable paced once, then settled near Edith's chair, his body angled outward. The wind howled. Snow struck the windows sideways. Sable rose abruptly and went to the back door, whining once, low, urgent. Mason followed, pulling on boots and coat. The snow behind the cabin lay disturbed in a way that didn't belong to weather. Sable led him to the base of a wooden post near the shed and stopped, nose pressed to the ground. Mason knelt and dug with gloved hands. Another device surfaced, larger this. Time, wires bundled tight, a battery pack sealed against moisture. Not a tracker. Preparation. Mason's jaw tightened. This wasn't intimidation alone. It was rehearsal. Rehook arrived as the wind surged and the lamps flickered. Sable froze, head lifted, ears angled toward the tree line. He did not growl. He did not retreat. He stood and waited, as if the night itself were about to answer. Mason felt it too, a sense of timing aligning, the way moments sometimes did before everything changed. He covered the device and went inside, sealing the door. He did not sleep. At dawn, he called Connor Wren. Connor arrived with the careful haste of a man walking a line. In daylight, Connor looked older, eyes shadowed, jaw tight with restraint. He listened as Mason showed him the device, the photos, the pattern of visits. Connor rubbed his face with one hand. "North Star's been difficult," he admitted. "They have lawyers, paper trails." He looked up. "But this," he gestured to the device. "This isn't lending." Mason nodded. "I've looped Harper," he said. Connor exhaled. "Good." Harper arrived an hour later, parka dusted with snow, eyes bright with a mix of resolve and concern. She examined the device, photographed it, asked precise questions. "They're escalating," she said. "When pressure doesn't work, they cut utilities. When fear doesn't work, they prepare." Edith's cough worsened by afternoon, her fever creeping. Mason drove her to the clinic again. The doctor frowned deeper this time, increased medication, warned about exposure. "She needs stability," she said. "Stress will slow recovery." Mason nodded, feeling the narrowing corridor. Evening brought the message. It came to Mason's phone from an unknown number, the text stark against the dim cabin light. "Return what isn't yours. or the old woman won't have a place to stay." Mason stared at the screen until the words blurred. Sable approached quietly and rested his head against Mason's hand. The weight was solid, grounding, not comfort exactly, but reminder. Mason understood. This wasn't about retreat anymore. It was about choosing where to stand when silence became permission. He powered down the phone and looked out at the darkening mountain. The fire burned steady. The line had been drawn. Daylight offered no mercy, only clarity. The sky over Crow Ridge was a brittle white, clouds stretched thin like gauze over bone. Mason parked 2 streets away from Edith's old house, choosing distance over convenience. Harper Vale pulled her parka tighter, breath fogging as she scanned the quiet road, while Deputy Connor Wren adjusted his hat and checked the empty sidewalks with the practiced caution of someone who knew how small towns hid their secrets in plain sight. Connor looked different out of uniform, still solid, still alert, but more exposed. The badge usually absorbed suspicion. Without it, he was just a man choosing where to stand. "We do this clean," Connor said quietly. "In and out." Mason nodded. Sable jumped down from the truck last, landing carefully on his bad leg, then lifting his head as the house came into view. The place stood exactly as Edith had described it. Cedar siding dulled by winter, porch rails still sturdy, a wreath frozen into the shape of a memory. Curtains hung unevenly inside. Someone had rushed the closure. Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the recognition of a life interrupted. They entered through the back, Connor's key turning in the lock with a sound that echoed too loudly in the empty kitchen. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the faint sweetness of old wood and dust. Furniture remained where Edith had left it. A small table with 1 chair pulled back, a lamp tilted slightly to the left, family photos lining a shelf. Harper paused at one picture, a younger Edith with her children, faces bright, arms linked. "They didn't even clear it out," Harper murmured. Mason moved through the rooms methodically, eyes tracing details. The sewing machine sat by the window, threads still looped, as if Edith had simply stepped out for coffee. Connor swallowed hard. "This isn't how foreclosures are supposed to look," he said. Sable stood at the top of the basement stairs, ears pricked. He sniffed once, then twice, then descended slowly, nails clicking against wood. Mason followed, flashlight cutting through the dim. The basement smelled wrong. Sharp, chemical. Gasoline layered over metal. Sable led him to the far wall where new boards had been nailed over older planks. He sat and looked back at Mason, eyes steady. Mason pried the boards loose. Behind them lay a cramped space stacked with boxes and folders, labels handwritten and crossed out, contracts stamped and restamped. Harper joined him, breath catching. "This is it," she said. "Fake adjustments, duplicate signatures." Connor flipped through a ledger and went still. "These dates," he said slowly. "I recognize the authorizations." He looked up, jaw tight. "There are town officials on this." The realization landed heavy and unavoidable. Footsteps sounded above. Mason stiffened. Voices followed. Too close, too confident. Silas Kett's laugh cut through the house like a blade wrapped in silk. "You should have stayed warm," Silas said from the kitchen. The moment fractured. Mason grabbed what he could, folders, the ledger, and shoved them into Harper's bag. "Go," he whispered. Sable bristled, a low sound rumbling in his chest for the first time. They bolted through the basement door and out into the yard as shouts followed. Snow gave way beneath their feet, uneven and treacherous. Silas and his men poured out the back door. Harper slipped on ice and went down hard, the bag skidding away. Mason turned without hesitation. He dropped the files and hauled her up, arm locked around her shoulders. Connor fired a warning shot into the air, the crack splitting the quiet. Sable charged, not to attack, but to block, positioning himself between the men and the fallen papers, teeth bared now, eyes blazing. It bought them seconds. They ran. They didn't stop until the trees swallowed the house and the sounds behind them thinned into wind. Back at the cabin, the cost became clear. The evidence they'd carried was partial at best. Enough to confirm the truth, not enough to end it. Edith sat by the fire when they returned, wrapped in a blanket, eyes hollow. She didn't ask what they'd found. She knew. Mason knelt in front of her, something in him breaking open. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. The words tasted old. "I couldn't protect her," he added, voice low, speaking to a ghost as much as a woman. Edith placed a hand on his cheek, fingers trembling. "You stayed," she said. "That counts." Sable laid his head on her knee, body shaking with a restrained whine. The fire cracked. Outside, snow fell, erasing footprints that didn't deserve to last. Mason sat with them, understanding at last that saving a home wasn't always about walls. Sometimes it was about standing when something sacred had already been taken. North Star did not retreat. They countered. The shift was subtle at first, the way pressure always was when it wanted to look legitimate. Letters arrived addressed to Edith, thick envelopes heavy with legal language and warnings. A lawsuit followed, neat and clinical, accusing her of trespass and misrepresentation, painting her as an irresponsible borrower who had abandoned her obligations. Rumors spread in town, carried gently by voices that claimed concern while repeating the same phrases. Deputy Connor Wren felt the squeeze next. A call from his supervisor, polite but firm. Questions about procedure. About why he'd been seen near a property under active foreclosure. Connor took it with a straight spine and a clenched jaw, his sense of duty pulling against the reality that duty did not always protect those who exercised it honestly. Mason watched all of it unfold with the calm of someone who recognized a familiar battlefield. But his body did not forget as easily as his mind wanted it to. The wind began to unsettle him, not the sound itself, but the way it threaded through the trees at night, rising and falling like distant engines. Once, while lighting the stove, his hand shook badly enough that the match burned him before he dropped it. He stared at the mark on his skin longer than necessary, breathing through the surge, grounding himself the way he had learned years ago, naming objects in the room, counting seconds, forcing his pulse to slow. Edith noticed everything. She noticed the way his shoulders tightened when doors slammed, the way his eyes tracked shadows longer than they needed to. One evening, as snow pressed against the windows and the radio murmured low, she spoke without turning from the fire. "You don't need to save me," she said gently. Mason looked up, startled. "You just need to stay," Edith continued. "That's all." The words settled into him, heavy and unexpected. Staying had always cost him more than leaving. Harper? Through the thin wall, Mason heard voices. Silas Ketz, low and controlled, and another man's, rougher, impatient. They spoke of the town hall meeting scheduled for the next night, of files, of fire. Rehook came in the silence between words when Mason realized he wasn't listening to a threat, but to a timetable. He stepped back, heart steady now, clarity returning with brutal precision. He waited until the men left, then moved. He found the documents hidden beneath floorboards, original contracts, signatures unaltered, proof meant to disappear in flames. As Mason emerged, Silas rounded the corner, surprise flickering across his face before calculation took over. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Mason moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Silas and pinning him without rage. Silas's breath came hard, eyes burning with frustration. "You think this ends something?" he spat. Mason tightened his grip just enough. "The law will," he said, voice steady. This time Mason was not too late. The night of the town meeting arrived with a cold so sharp it felt intentional, as if winter itself wanted to listen. Crow Ridge's community hall glowed against the snow, windows fogged, doors opening and closing with gusts of breath and anticipation. Inside, people stamped their feet, shrugged off coats, and took seats that had not all been filled in years. Mason stood near the back at first, posture easy, but alert, the old discipline settling him into stillness. Sable lay at his feet, calm, watchful, his amber eyes tracking the room as if counting heartbeats. Edith sat 2 rows ahead, wrapped in a knitted scarf, hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than she had at the cabin, but steadier, as though the warmth of shared presence had given her a spine she could lean on. Harper Vale took the stage with a stack of notes and a voice that carried. She was tall and spare, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, eyes bright with a resolve that came from having listened too long, to people who thought no one would hear them. She spoke slowly at first, outlining patterns without accusation, interest rates that climbed without notice, documents revised after signatures, homes seized with unusual speed. Faces in the crowd shifted. Murmurs rippled. When she named North Star Lending, the sound sharpened. Deputy Connor Wren followed, uniform crisp, jaw set. He presented the corroboration, timelines, logs, permits approved without review. He did not embellish. He did not plead. He let the facts do the work, his steadiness anchoring the room. Mason stepped forward last. He placed the recovered originals on the table, contracts unaltered, signatures intact. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Silence fell in a way that felt earned. The representatives from North Star sat rigid, eyes calculating exits. Gage Holloway stood then, a man of comfortable build and careful grooming, hair silvered at the temples, coat tailored to suggest trust. He smiled too quickly, offered reassurances that felt rehearsed. He took a step back. Sable rose, not with a bark, not with a snarl, just a sudden, unmistakable intensity. His body angled, nose lifted, a low sound vibrating through his chest like a warning bell struck once. Mason felt it before he understood it. Gasoline. The smell clung to Gage's sleeve, faint but wrong, threaded beneath cologne. Rehook came in the way Sable's gaze flicked toward the old maintenance road on the map pinned to the wall, then back to Mason, then to the door. A plan still in motion. Mason moved. Connor moved. The room broke into motion behind them as officers followed the instinct that had just been named. They found the old warehouse just as flames licked at the edge of a fuel-soaked pallet. Too late to pretend, early enough to stop it. Gage was arrested under the glare of floodlights, his composure finally cracking. By morning, federal agents arrived. North Star's offices were sealed. Phones rang unanswered. Edith's case moved swiftly then, not a miracle, not a reversal of winter, but a stay granted, a home returned pending full proceedings. Justice, late but breathing. Weeks passed, snow softened into something gentler. The cabin changed without announcing itself as changed. Extra chairs appeared. A kettle stayed warm longer. Neighbors arrived with folded hands and hesitant smiles, then with casseroles and questions. The fireplace did what fires had always done when tended. It gathered people who needed light. Edith took to knitting by the hearth, her fingers remembering a rhythm that steadied her breath. Sable slept at her feet, rising now and then to greet someone new with a measured wag. Mason stood at the window some evenings, watching flakes fall into lamplight, noticing the quiet without mistaking it for emptiness. He did not go looking for meaning. He had learned that doing so often sent it running. Meaning, it turned out, had found him. On a night when a door opened, and staying became an act of courage. Miracles do not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come as a warm room on a ruthless night, a hand that chooses to open a door, and a loyal dog whose instincts refuse to let a good soul disappear into the snow. If God can place stars in a winter sky, He can also place help in our path at the exact moment we think we are most alone. In Crow Ridge, the miracle was not that hardship vanished overnight. The miracle was that love showed up anyway, steady and practical, turning fear into courage and silence into a lighthouse. In everyday life, most of us will never face a locked house in a blizzard or a corrupt company in the shadows. But we all meet smaller storms: a neighbor who is quietly struggling, an elder who feels forgotten, a family weighed down by bills and worry, a heart carrying grief that no one can see. And in those moments, God often works through ordinary people who choose to do one ordinary thing with extraordinary faith: to listen, to show up, to stand beside someone when it would be easier to walk away. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what you believe God is teaching you in this season of life. And if you want more stories of faith, courage, and second chances, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next one. May the Lord bless you and keep you, bring warmth to your home, peace to your mind, strength to your heart, and protection over everyone you love.